There's a man most people in his neighborhood never truly understood. He drove a car that was 11 years old. He wore the same style of jacket in winter for over a decade. He ate meals prepared at home almost without exception, and when neighbors asked why he never renovated his house, a modest structure in a quiet district of Nagoya, he would pause, smile slightly, and say nothing that satisfied them. When he died at 83, the accountants discovered something that made the local news. Kenji Morimoto had accumulated just over $2 million in assets, real estate, equities, cash reserves, structured with a precision that surprised even the professionals who reviewed his estate. His monthly housing cost for the last 22 years of his life had been the equivalent of $200 American. He was not poor. He was not eccentric. He was not depriving himself of anything he valued. He was practicing something his father had taught him and his grandfather before that, a system of thinking about money that has no exact translation in English, not because the language lacks the words, but because the culture never needed to name it openly. It was simply how serious people behaved. In the West, we have been taught to display our financial progress. The house, the car, the vacation. These are meant to signal that we are succeeding. In Japan, among those who accumulated generational wealth quietly, the logic ran in precisely the opposite direction. Visibility was not a reward, it was a liability. That distinction is not cosmetic, it is structural, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. If you have ever felt that something essential was missing from every financial conversation you encountered in America, every book, every seminar, every well-meaning piece of advice from someone who meant well but had never questioned the system they were operating inside, you were not wrong. Something was missing. It was absent before it ever had the chance to arrive. What follows is the account of where that knowledge came from, what it is precisely, and how a man like Kenji Morimoto used it to build a life that looked completely ordinary from the outside and was extraordinary in every way that actually mattered. The roots of this do not begin in the 20th century. They do not begin with post-war Japanese reconstruction or the economic miracle of the 1970s or any modern phenomenon that financial analysts in New York or London might reference in a conference room. They begin in the city of Osaka during the early Edo period, among a class of merchants who had already solved a problem that would not even be recognized as a problem in the West for another 300 years. The Edo period, which ran from 1603 to 1868, created something genuinely unusual in world history, a society that was almost entirely closed to outside economic influence for over 2 centuries. No significant foreign trade, no colonial extraction of external resources, no speculative bubbles imported from Amsterdam or London, no constant stream of foreign goods flowing in to manufacture new categories of desire. What this enforced isolation produced, almost by necessity, was an internal economy that had to develop its own logic entirely from the ground up, without the distortions that external commercial pressure introduces. In Osaka, which functioned as the commercial and financial heart of Edo, Japan, a merchant class emerged that became extraordinarily sophisticated in its financial thinking over time. They were called the chonin, literally the townspeople, and they occupied a genuinely paradoxical position in Japanese society. Under the rigid Confucian social hierarchy of the period, merchants ranked below farmers, artisans, and samurai. They were considered, in the moral language of the time, suspect, people who produced nothing with their hands and profited from the labor and need of others. And yet, despite that official low status, they accumulated wealth at a scale that made the aristocracy deeply uncomfortable. The samurai class had the swords and the social prestige. The chonin had the money. That tension shaped everything about how the most successful merchant families behaved. Because to display wealth was to invite regulation, confiscation, and the resentment of a class that outranked you socially and could act on that resentment through power. The most carefully studied of these merchant families are the Mitsui, who began as sake brewers and pawnbrokers in Ise province, before establishing significant commercial operations in Edo and Kyoto in the mid-1600s. By the early 1700s, the patriarch Mitsui Takatoshi had built what historians now recognize as one of the world's earliest examples of a modern integrated retail and financial operation. He pioneered fixed pricing, cash transactions, and a customer service philosophy that was revolutionary for its time. But what is rarely discussed, outside of Japanese academic circles and the private conversations of families who maintained this tradition, is the internal code that governed how the Mitsui family related to wealth itself. Mitsui Takatoshi left behind a document known informally as the Chonin Koken Roku, a record of merchant wisdom circulated within the family and kept from public view that outlined not merely business practices, but a complete philosophy of wealth. Its central argument was this: the display of accumulated wealth is not a reward for discipline. It is the destruction of discipline. Visible consumption alerts competitors, invites social obligation, creates expectations that become structural costs, distorts your own perception of what is normal and what is necessary, and, most critically, gradually erodes the productive psychological tension that made accumulation possible in the first place. This was not an argument for poverty. The Mitsui family lived well. They ate well. They maintained their properties. They clothed themselves appropriately. But the standard was calibrated with deliberate care, and it was never allowed to expand simply because expansion had become possible. The moment the lifestyle began to grow to match the wealth the family understood was the moment the wealth began to move in the wrong direction. This idea was reinforced through a completely different path by the samurai class. The samurai ethos included a concept known as seikatsu no shokei, the deliberate calibration of one's standard of living as a form of strategic discipline. A warrior who became accustomed to comfort was a warrior whose judgment would eventually be compromised when comfort was temporarily removed. This was not suffering imposed from outside. It was precision chosen from within. You selected, consciously and continuously, the level of material life that would keep your judgment clear and your decision-making unaffected by the fear of losing what you had grown to expect. What the great Osaka merchant families did across the 17th and 18th centuries was absorb this samurai logic and translate it into commercial terms. They did not live modestly because they lacked money. They lived modestly because they had developed a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between lifestyle inflation and the gradual invisible erosion of financial power. While merchants in Amsterdam were speculating on tulip futures and constructing canal houses whose architectural grandeur was specifically designed to announce their net worth to every person who passed, the great merchant families of Edo, Japan, were doing something almost incomprehensible by the standards of Western commerce at the time. They were building systems to keep their wealth invisible, not just from their neighbors, but from themselves. Not from fear or greed, but from strategic discipline. From a long-term orientation so deeply embedded in their thinking that short-term display felt not merely wasteful, but structurally dangerous. This is the historical foundation from which Kenji Morimoto's family drew their practice across 4 generations, and it leads directly to the principle at the center of this teaching. A principle with a name, a specific architecture, and a psychological logic that, once understood, changes the way you see every financial decision you have ever made. The concept is called bunpai no sochi. Bunpai means distribution or deliberate allocation. Sochi means measure, or more precisely, an intentional arrangement, a structure created on purpose to produce a specific outcome. Together, the phrase points to a practice that might be translated as the structured and permanent separation of what you earn from what you experience as available to spend. The separation is not temporary. It is not a phase. It is an architectural decision that, once made and maintained, fundamentally reorganizes the psychology of every financial choice that follows. Let me explain what this means in practice, because with this particular teaching, The philosophy and the practice cannot be separated. Understanding one without the other produces nothing. Kenji Morimoto, like his father before him and his grandfather before that, operated with a mental and structural architecture that divided his financial life into three distinct chambers, not two, as virtually every Western budgeting system suggests. Income on one side, expenses on the other, but three, each with its own logic, its own identity, and its own psychological boundary that was treated as nearly inviolable. The first chamber was what his family called the living allocation, the money designated for daily life, for the house, for food, for transportation, for the genuine needs and reasonable pleasures of an ordinary human existence. This chamber was tended to with care, but it was also kept deliberately contained. It did not expand simply because the other chambers were growing. Its boundaries were set by what was genuinely needed for a dignified life, not by what had become possible. The second chamber was what Kenji's father described as working capital, money whose sole and permanent purpose was to generate more money, and which was, in a very real psychological sense, never experienced as belonging to the man who had earned it. It was not his to spend. It was not competing with the kitchen renovation or the newer car. It existed in a different category of reality, tended to and monitored, but never touched for personal consumption. This money worked. That was its entire identity. The third chamber was the obligation reserve, funds set aside with equal seriousness for responsibilities that were understood to be non-negotiable, family needs that might arise without warning, community obligations that Japanese merchant culture took seriously as a form of long-term relationship capital and the genuine unpredictability of a long life. This was not an emergency fund in the American sense, which is often conceived as temporary and which people frequently raid without guilt. This was a permanent structural commitment, a recognition that a well-built financial life includes responsibilities that are not about personal enjoyment and cannot be treated as optional. The critical insight, the one that separates Bunpai no Sochi from any Western budgeting framework you have encountered in a book or a financial planning session, is that these chambers were not merely categories on a spreadsheet. They were treated as belonging, psychologically, to different people. The man who lived in the $200 house was not the same man who owned $2 million in productive assets. They were, by deliberate design, kept separate in consciousness. The first man had modest needs and arranged his daily life accordingly. The second man, the financial identity, the one who owned the working capital, was accumulating quietly, invisibly, without interference from the first man's daily experience of money. This is precisely where Western personal finance has consistently failed to go deeply enough. Every system I've encountered in American financial literature treats the individual as a single, unified economic actor who must balance all desires, all needs, and all long-term goals within the same psychological space at the same time. You earn, you budget, you allocate. But all of it happens in one field of consciousness, which means that a new desire, a larger house, a newer car, a vacation that feels deserved after years of work, is always competing directly and immediately with the capital that is supposed to be untouchable. The Bunpai no Sochi system removes that competition structurally at the level of architecture rather than willpower. The working capital does not compete with your desire for a kitchen renovation because in the genuine experience of the mind that has built this system correctly, it does not belong to you in that way. It belongs to a different identity. Willpower is unreliable. Architecture is not. The Japanese merchant families understood this distinction centuries before behavioral psychology gave it a name. There is a Japanese proverb that touches this understanding with unusual precision, nanakorobi yaoki. It is commonly translated as fall 7 times, rise 8. But within the tradition of Edo merchant financial philosophy, the deeper meaning concerns continuity across disruption. The wealth does not disappear when life disrupts, when illness comes, when the economy turns difficult, when unexpected obligations arise. because the wealth was never located inside the disruption to begin with. It was held separately, in a chamber that daily life could not reach. Kaizen, the principle of continuous, non-dramatic, incremental improvement, applies here in a dimension that is almost never discussed when Westerners invoke the concept. Most people associate Kaizen with manufacturing efficiency or personal productivity. But Kenji Morimoto's family applied it with complete seriousness to the working capital chamber. Each month, without drama and without celebration, the flow into that second chamber increased by a small amount, not through windfalls, not through speculation, not through any single dramatic decision, through a consistency so quiet and so habitual that it did not register emotionally as sacrifice. It simply became the natural condition of things, as unremarkable and as reliable as breathing. This is the system in its complete form, not a trick, not a shortcut, not a motivational reframing. A structural redesign of how money is experienced at the psychological level, and an architectural decision that protects the accumulation from the daily self by placing them deliberately and permanently in different rooms. Now we must ask honestly why this understanding never crossed the ocean. Not to assign blame. That is not a productive direction. But to understand the specific cultural and economic conditions that made transmission impossible. Because understanding the barrier is part of understanding why the knowledge feels so foreign when you first encounter it. When the great merchant families of Osaka were refining bunpai no sochi during the Edo period, they were operating inside a context with no real equivalent in European or American commercial history. Their society was closed. Foreign goods were restricted to near zero. There was no mechanism by which lifestyle inflation could be continuously fed by an endless stream of new products, new fashions, new categories of desire arriving from outside the culture each season. The external world was not knocking on the door. Desire, in that environment, was a manageable and relatively stable force. European and later American commercial culture developed in precisely the opposite environment. The expansion of Atlantic trade routes in the 16th and 17th centuries meant that desire itself became a market, an industry with its own infrastructure and its own economic logic. New goods from Asia, from the Americas, from Africa entered Western consciousness at an accelerating pace. By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had built the machinery to manufacture not just products, but the desire for those products at enormous scale. Advertising, as an institution, is not merely a tool for selling specific items. It is a system for keeping all three chambers of your financial life permanently merged, permanently in competition with one another, because a consumer whose working capital is psychologically indistinguishable from his spending money is a far more productive consumer than one who has built genuine internal walls. There is also a deeper cultural element that must be acknowledged honestly. Western Protestant theology, particularly in its Calvinist expression, developed a specific idea about the relationship between material prosperity and moral standing that has no equivalent in Japanese merchant culture. The Calvinist framework, refined over centuries into something that no longer requires explicit religious language to function, holds that visible success is a legitimate and meaningful signal of personal virtue. The man with the fine house and the new car is not merely comfortable. He is, in some ambient cultural sense, approved. His prosperity is taken as evidence of his discipline, his intelligence, his worthiness. In that framework, living modestly when you could live grandly is not admirable. It is strange. It raises questions. It makes neighbors uncomfortable in a way they cannot quite articulate. Kenji Morimoto's neighbors experienced exactly this discomfort for decades without ever understanding its source. The Mitsui family records contain explicit warnings, written in the 1700s, but describing a human tendency that is timeless, against what they called utsuri-ki, a wandering spirit attracted to novelty, to comfort, to the continuously expanding definition of what a successful person is supposed to own. They had watched other merchant families, families of genuine capability and initial discipline, collapse within 2 generations when Utsuriki was permitted to take hold. The wealth did not disappear through bad investments or business failures. It disappeared through the gradual, invisible expansion of the living allocation until it consumed everything that should have remained in the working capital chamber. Western financial publishing, when it emerged as a mass-market genre in the 20th century, inherited all of these cultural assumptions without examining a single one of them. The books told you to budget. They told you to invest in index funds. They told you occasionally to delay gratification. But they never told you to build a genuine structural separation between your financial identities, because that idea arrived from a tradition that never fed into Western financial thought. It was transmitted orally, within families, in a language and a cultural context that Western financial scholars never thought to examine for practical wisdom. The knowledge existed. It worked across centuries. It built quiet fortunes that outlasted the families who displayed their wealth loudly. And it never crossed the ocean. Not because anyone deliberately withheld it, but because no one on the Western side was looking in the right direction. Until now. Consider what it would mean to apply this in your own life. Not as a complete reinvention of who you are, not as a discipline that demands you become an entirely different person, but as a structural adjustment that works with the psychology you already have rather than against it. The first step is architectural and entirely practical. Open a separate account, distinct from your checking account, distinct from any existing savings account, and commit to it a psychological designation that is absolute. This is working capital. It is not available. It belongs to your financial identity, not to your daily self. The account exists. You monitor it. You never touch it for personal consumption. In the beginning, the amount you move into it monthly matters far less than the consistency and the psychological commitment. You are not building a number yet. You are building the architecture. The number will grow on its own once the structure is solid. The second step is to examine your living allocation, not with a spirit of aggressive cutting, which produces resentment and eventual collapse, but with honest curiosity. Where has this allocation expanded to fill space that was never genuinely necessary? What has become normal that was once a luxury, not because your life genuinely required it, but because the culture around you continuously expanded the definition of what a person at your stage of life is supposed to have? Kenji Morimoto's $200 housing situation was not the cause of his wealth. It was the visible expression of a mind that had developed genuine clarity about the difference between what it needed and what it had simply learned to expect. That distinction, for most Americans who grew up in the second half of the 20th century inside a culture specifically designed to blur it, was never clearly taught. It can still be learned. It is learned not through dramatic sacrifice, but through a series of quiet, honest observations made without self-judgment. The third step is to bring Kaizen to the working capital chamber directly. Each quarter, not each month, which can feel pressured, increase the automatic transfer by a small amount. Not a dramatic amount, an amount that does not register as pain. Over 2 years, this practice produces a momentum that begins to feel less like discipline and more like the natural state of your financial life. The architecture has become habitual. The separation has become real. The two identities, the man who lives and the man who accumulates, have found their respective rooms and stopped competing. This is not deprivation. It is precision. There is a meaningful and important difference between the two, and feeling that difference, not merely understanding it conceptually, is perhaps the most valuable work this teaching asks of you. The man who understood all of this, who sat in his modest house in Nagoya for 22 years, who drove his aging car without embarrassment, who watched $2 million work in complete silence, was not a man who had sacrificed his life for a number. He was a man who had arranged his life so that money and daily experience never competed with each other. They occupied genuinely different spaces, both were tended to with care, neither interfered with the other. And because of that clean separation, both could be what they were meant to be. The house was a home. Quiet, sufficient, genuinely comfortable in the ways that mattered. The $2 million was working capital, invisible, productive, and entirely protected from the daily self. That is the system. That is Bunpai no Sochi in practice across a lifetime. What I want you to hold as we close this particular teaching is something that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the kind of person who finds himself watching something like this at this stage of his life. You came to this understanding by a path that most people around you never walked. You sensed, perhaps for years before you could have articulated it, that the American relationship with money was built on a foundation that nobody had examined with honesty. You felt that there was a different way of approaching all of this, quieter, more principled, longer in its thinking, more aligned with how serious people actually build serious lives. That instinct was not nostalgia for something simpler. It was not idealism disconnected from reality. It was accurate financial intuition that the culture around you consistently discouraged, because a person with accurate financial intuition is a more difficult consumer. The knowledge you were never given was not absent because it was deliberately hidden from you. It was absent because the system you lived inside had no mechanism for transmitting it and no incentive to develop one. But you kept looking. You kept asking the question even when the answers felt incomplete, even when the books you read gave you techniques without philosophy, strategies without foundation. Kenji Morimoto's neighbors saw the car and drew their conclusions. They never revised those conclusions because he never asked them to. He understood something that those who study the long-term financial wisdom of the Edo period come to understand with time. The architecture of genuine wealth functions best when it is invisible, not from shame, not from false modesty, from precision, from the quiet confidence of a man who knows exactly where everything is and exactly why it is there. You now understand something about the structure of that architecture that most people who grew up in this country were simply never given the opportunity to understand. That is not a minor thing. It is the beginning of a genuinely different relationship with money, with time, and with the question of what a well-built life actually looks and feels like from the inside when no one else is watching. There is one more dimension of this teaching that we have not yet reached. It concerns the third chamber, the obligation reserve, and the specific way the Mitsui family used it across generations and the refinement that Kenji Morimoto brought to that practice over 40 years of careful application. That dimension carries its own name, its own historical roots, and a psychological logic that may be the most counterintuitive piece of this entire tradition. We will go there in the next teaching.